name is Lisa Graves, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Media and Democracy. We were founded here in Wisconsin, in Madison, in 1993, and I became the Executive Director in 2009. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this part of the Democracy Convention here in Madison, and welcome those of you who are from Madison to this gathering, and those of you who have traveled many distances to be here to this session as a whole, and to this particular panel to talk about the American Legislative Exchange Council, and also to have a chance to talk about some next steps and things that are underway in the effort to expose, it's ALEC Exposed, .org, in the effort to expose the fact that corporations are voting on legislation behind closed doors through ALEC task forces, legislation to rewrite our rights. The Center for Media and Democracy is proud to be part of this effort to help, in essence, investigate the American Legislative Exchange Council, to expose this practice by which corporations are exerting extraordinary influence on our laws and our rights, and to help empower people across the country, journalists, citizen journalists, activists, and others, to learn more about this, to share more about this, and to help connect the dots between the ALEC corporations, the ALEC politicians, the ALEC legislation, both in the states and in the national legislature, in the governorships, and perhaps in the presidency at some point, given some of the ALEC alums and where they have gone and where they look to be going. So, we launched the site on July 13th of this year as The Nation magazine broke the story in a special edition. If you haven't read all the articles that came out in the special edition, I would urge you to do so. There's a lot of really good work that was done as part of that, part of this expose. Obviously, we have tremendous resources available through the ALEC Exposed site and through our SourceWatch sites and through our PR Watch site that are on this banner below.
But, you know, so in the worker protection area, ALEC has long tried to think of ways to screw workers and has a kind of panoply of options for that, which are mostly predictable. I think in what I was especially surprised by actually in the labor law area was that, yes, there was a lot of kind of how to make, there's a lot of how to make unions have to report on what is political activity, how to give public sector workers the right to opt out of political dues, how to make it just harder to be a union in terms of reporting and accounting, etc. That's all up there. In fact, many of the worst things, actually all of the incredibly pernicious things about what Walker did to public sector unions in this state, not really there. It makes you feel either like there's a secret place where they do the more devious stuff, or that Scott Walker's smart. And anyway, but all that stuff you will find public sector worker union things that will make it harder to be a public sector union are up there, but also just labor standard destruction stuff. So preemption, so if any city passes a living wage law or an alternative minimum wage, a higher minimum wage, you know, some cities under home rule rights have these ability to do these things. They have all the preemption that you would need. If something good happened in a city in your state, here's the preemption that will disallow that from happening. So sick leave happened in Milwaukee, and that was preempted by the state. That's the kind of thing they have up there, just like that. And also a lot of things in terms of workers' comp, and just tipping it slightly in different ways towards the employer. Not surprising, but again, just laws in every area. They actually have a thing they call publicopoly. You can get to this on their website. And it's sort of like, we can privatize anything game. It's mimicking monopoly, and they don't really follow the trajectory of the game very well. They, you know, sort of give up after the first page, but you can click on this monopoly board of all the areas you want to privatize. And they have model legislation in each one of those areas. How to go after DNR, how to go after corrections, how to go, so that's all there. But what their kind of crown jewel of privatization is a structure that really creates what is called a council on competitiveness or a committee on government services, and you set up people. You set up a commission, probably some elected officials, some privately appointed, usually by the governor, to review any area of state provision of services and ponder the ability to move that into the private sector. And it also gives, and that infrastructure generally is a place where any private business person could come and say, I can do that for less. So it sets up a structure, a kind of presumption of privatization, a presumption that privatization is probably good, and there's some ways to move it, and here's how we're going to do it. It's modeled mostly after something that happened in Florida in 1996. But it's moved, that one is the one that was easiest for me to find, moving in legislatures, both last session and this session. South Carolina's proposed legislation is almost literally word for word the ALEC bill. And so you can see that one triply. If there's a council on competitiveness in your state, or something that sounds like a kind of funny name about good government that has a bunch of the buddies of the governor on it, you know what, we'll go look at that legislation and follow ALEC Exposed to the privatization thing. The other one is tax policy, and then I'm sure I'm running out of time here, but you know, I think in some ways if the program of the right has been to destroy the state in every way possible, you know, one of the best ways to do that is just choke revenues, choke revenues, choke revenues. And of course they have a few creative ways to choke revenues. Interestingly, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which got kind of a bad name for losing in Colorado 2 or 3 years ago, they don't have anything called TABOR up there. They have things that work much like TABOR. If you know the structure of a Taxpayer Bill of Rights, it's a constitutional amendment to essentially limit increases in total state revenues to a kind of multiplier from the CPI, the inflation, consumer price index, and population growth. And it just caps the ability to grow government faster than that. They actually have one up there now that's got a similar, you know, all the names are, it's like a study in duplicity. There's a mini deconstruction dissertations to be written on that part of it. But there's one that sort of actually ratchets down government even when revenues go up. It doesn't allow, you know, when your income tax goes up, you know, because as you know, revenues collapse in the context of economic meltdown, right? And so when the revenues collapse, then you kind of tamp everything down to that level, and when they increase again, what you have in legislated is this inability to grow with your revenues and the kind of mandatory sending out of checks, which is sort of even worse than TABOR, actually, structurally, in terms of what it would do to state budgets. But anyway, it's all up there, and you can find it, and it can depress and overwhelm you. And so, I won't quite stop there, but I think, you know, it gives you, it isn't everything that's going to go on bad in your state. There are things moving in all these states that are bad that are not born here. Some solace there, huh? But it is many things like all the bad stuff happening in your state are there, and it's a good kind of way to see a kind of consistent set of themes and way of talking about it that gives you a little bit more of a handle on how they're going to attack and what they are going to pursue. So I would say, you know, it's a great, and it is an unbelievably enormous resource. It may seem overwhelming. I would go into it with something specific in mind rather than a kind of general attempt to get your hands on it, I think, because it will seem too big to you. Or if you are like me, and I only did a small part of it, it will seem like too much. And it's probably good to kind of go in with something specific in mind, or pay attention to exactly what's going on in your state, go try to find that there, or something like that.
After ALECexposed.org was launched, in the midst of tremendous activism that was going on across the country and through daily posts and the people working on exposing ALEC over there, there was an effort for a number of people to go to the conference in New Orleans. and that was the ALEC annual convention. At that convention, one of the things that we heard from the inside was that there, at least at one of the sessions, there was a tremendous conversation about the imperative to privatize public assets, including basically the idea that government should just be a tenant of corporations, that government should sell off state assets, buildings that are owned by the people of the state, that have been paid for over years by the people of the state, by the taxpayers, by Americans, sell those buildings off to corporations, and then come back and appeal to these corporations to be their tenants and pay them rent for our buildings going forward. It's really, I have to say, remarkable, astonishing, appalling, morally repugnant, in my view. But indeed, this is part of the tenor of this conversation, this rampant effort to exploit the economic crisis that was caused by an array of terrible policies, both anti-regulatory policies and war spending and other spending policies under the Bush administration and beyond, and exploit the crisis in order to basically have a run on the assets that belong to the people of the United States, that belong to every person in this room. That's part of the ALEC agenda. And one of the things we do know as well is that there have been some changes to the ALEC website, the ALEC organizational website, including on the publicopoly front, to perhaps try to reshape this, what they perhaps thought was, or perhaps what someone thought was a clever take on the game Monopoly, in order to perhaps not take such a cheeky public take on taking from the public. So,
so you can't see it.
I'm sorry, Laura.
It was so tacky.
It was.
I'm sorry,
so,
it's gone.
Yes, so it is preserved in some respects. I'm sure that
Yes.
people have screen captured the image of the Monopoly board, and I know that there was an article that was done around the same week of the launch. It was published in these Times that talked about publicopoly, and so there is more on that. But as Laura said, the core notion among some of these bills that have been proposed, written by corporate lobbyists, and then voted on by corporate lobbyists side by side with politicians through ALEC task forces, is this agenda to advance corporate power, to increase corporate wealth, to take your tax dollars and basically make them the basis for profit for private corporations that, for example, might pay people a whole lot less, outsourcing, for instance, public sector police forces, in essence. Obviously, we've seen this in the prison immigration area that I think we're going to talk about in a moment, but in other areas in which basically, and let me just pause, I suppose I should say, well, Scott Walker didn't run on a campaign to privatize everything, or many things. Didn't run on a campaign to destroy the unions. It is the case that he did manage, as Milwaukee County executive, to basically attack court officers, state employees that work for the courts, and then privatize that to an entity that has split off in essence from Wackenhut. And that entity basically, so it killed Wisconsin jobs, and that entity, that corporation, brought in people from out of state to take lower paying positions. And so when they say they're going to save you money, they may be saving you money by basically killing the jobs of people who work in that state. That certainly was the case with Walker's specific instance with Walker. That act was not necessarily, and was not a bill by ALEC. But it is an example, perhaps, of this philosophy, of the consequence of this privatization binge, the effort to privatize anything that isn't nailed down and some things that are.
I'm going to speak about the ALEC bills relating to public safety, which include those relating to sentencing, bail, guns, and immigration. On the surface, many of these bills look like your basic tough-on-crime legislation, but as you imagine, there are corporate members of ALEC that benefit financially. The underlying purpose of many of the ALEC criminal justice bills is not public safety, but lining the pockets of the ALEC corporate members. So briefly, the ALEC criminal justice bills are passed by an ALEC task force that includes both legislators and corporations, and the corporate members have included the Corrections Corporation of America, the largest for-profit prison operator in the world. And for-profit prison corporations make more money when more people are behind bars, and many ALEC bills do just that. The ALEC Task Force also includes the Trade Association for the For-Profit Bail Bond Industry, an industry that has a history of corrupting the bail process, the judicial system, and the bail process, and which has been a target of reformers for years. And the ALEC bills are aimed at propping up this industry and thwarting any efforts at reform. And the NRA, the National Rifle Association, is also a member, and ALEC bills push NRA-supported gun laws. So over time, these tough-on-crime bills have been sold to the public as good for public safety, but they were actually approved and voted on by corporations that profit from these changes to the law. And these bills have become law without politicians disclosing they came from ALEC and without disclosing the corporate interests that pre-approved these bills and stand to benefit from their passage. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the NRA here. As you know, they're a formidable political force with a lot of money, and the bills they push through ALEC are pretty much what you'd expect. But I will note that the ALEC Task Force I'm discussing here is the Public Safety and Elections Task Force. So it's not only related for bills related to criminal justice, it also passes bills related to elections. This task force passed the ALEC voter ID bill, a version of which has become law in Wisconsin, and which I think Lisa is going to discuss in a little bit more depth. But the NRA has sat on this task force, so the NRA basically has had a voice and a vote in the bills that govern your election, govern your right to vote. So what I am going to focus on are the ALEC corporate members, including the for-profit prison industry and the bail bond industry. So first, I'll discuss the sentencing bills and the war on drugs bills. Many of these ALEC bills are from the early to mid-1990s when CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America, was the corporate co-chair of the task force. And at the time, ALEC boasted of their great success in the fact that so many of their crime bills were becoming law across the country. So in this stack of bills, there's bills that create new penalties for drug crimes and bills that enact harsher sentences. So basically, they're putting more people in prison for more time for new crimes and keeping them in prison for much longer. And I shouldn't have to mention that these bills have disproportionately affected people of color. In the 20 or so years since these ALEC corporate-backed laws started taking effect, we've seen a 300% increase in prison spending and a 274% increase in the number of those incarcerated. And to put those numbers in context, state spending on prisons has grown at 6 times the rate of state spending on higher education. Okay, I'm going to speak a little louder. Right, in Wisconsin, after some of these ALEC tough-on-crime sentencing bills became law, the annual budget for the state prison system increased by $500 million each year. It is now the third largest expenditure in the state budget. And you may have heard some of these numbers before, but America has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population, and about 1/4 of those incarcerated are there as the result of a drug conviction. So I'll mention again that CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America, was on the ALEC task force during the period ALEC approved these bills. And at the same time, ALEC was pushing tough-on-crime laws that led to prison overcrowding and necessitated the construction of new prisons. It was also pushing model bills to privatize those prisons, which basically have the effect of sending taxpayer dollars spent on putting so many more people behind bars into the pockets of the for-profit corporations that are also members of ALEC. So, and of course, tough-on-crime was in vogue among conservative legislators in the 1990s, so they were a particularly susceptible audience for these types of laws. And then I'll also note that locking people up does not result in a public safety benefit. If we just compare Wisconsin with our neighbor Minnesota, besides differences like the fact that our football team is much better and we sell beer on Sundays, our states are similar in a lot of ways. Our population numbers are about the same. Culturally and demographically, we're very similar, and our crime rates are about the same. But Wisconsin, because of the sentencing laws that we've enacted, we have about 2.5 times as many people in prison, and we spend twice as much on prisons as Minnesota does. So there's 2 main ALEC sentencing bills. Truth in sentencing requires inmates serve 85% of their full sentence without options for parole or supervised release, and 3 strikes you're out, which creates mandatory extended periods of incarceration for people who are convicted of more than one crime, sometimes even if it's on the same occasion. So what these laws really do is they take away incentive for prisoners to participate in the rehabilitative activities that are made available in prison, just because doing so is not going to result in reduced prison time. And it also eliminates the ability for judges and parole boards to decide that the financial and social costs of keeping a person behind bars no longer furthers public safety goals and is outweighed by, they just don't need to be behind bars any longer. So really, the effect of this is the focus is shifting from corrections and rehabilitation to just warehousing. Really, if a goal of prison is correction, there needs to be an opportunity for a person to no longer be incarcerated when they are corrected. And so basically that's what private prisons do, they warehouse people. So in truth in sentencing became law in most states. In '95 alone, it became law in 25 states. And guess who introduced truth in sentencing in Wisconsin? A young representative named Scott Walker. In the 7 years after the law took effect, Wisconsin's prison population increased 14%. We saw no additional decline in crime rates. And of course, when Walker introduced the bill, there was never any mention that ALEC or ALEC corporations had been behind it. And now that prison spending has become so expensive, you're beginning to see a rollback of some of these laws. And in Wisconsin, legislators have rolled back truth in sentencing in recent years. But after Governor Walker took office, he just reinstated truth in sentencing, an ALEC bill from the beginning. So I'll note that Wisconsin, unlike many states in the South and West, does not have private prisons. But during the same period of rising incarceration rates and more people behind bars, then Representative Scott Walker introduced several bills that would allow private prisons in Wisconsin. Although they did not pass, Wisconsin did house our growing number of incarcerated Wisconsinites in other states in private prisons. And in 1998, Walker stated that Corrections Corporation of America wanted to expand into Wisconsin, and although they have not done so yet, they have registered lobbyists in the state ever since. So I'm not going to discuss immigration and CCA. I'm going to leave that to hold. But I am going to discuss the for-profit bail bond industry, the industry's trade association is called the American Bail Coalition. They've been an ALEC board member for about 20 years. So I'm going to quickly describe the bail bond process so you can kind of understand what they're doing and why they need ALEC. It's basically when a person is arrested and accused of a crime, a judge sets bail at a preliminary hearing. Bail is supposed to be a certain amount of money the accused must post to get out of jail pending their actual court date. And the payment is supposed to provide an incentive that they show up. In Wisconsin, we're very progressive in this regard. Our bail system is run by the court and counties rather than a for-profit business. Commercial bail bonding has been banned since 1979 here. Here, a person pays their bail directly to the county, and if they appear at the court date, the amount is reimbursed minus court fees. Under the privatized system, which is actually how it operates in most states, a person pays a for-profit bail bond, then 10% of the bail set by a judge. And the bail bondsman is supposed to pledge that they'll pay 100% of the bond if the person does not show up. But in practice, many times this just doesn't happen. If a person doesn't show up, the bail bondsman's debt to the state is often waived. Additionally, the 10% the defendant pays to the bail bondsman is non-refundable, which can be a huge burden on low-income defendants. So regardless of whether the person actually shows up to their court date, and even if they're found innocent, they still have lost this 10% to the for-profit bail bondsman. And under the privatized system, a person still has the right to pay court 100% of the bail that was assigned to them by a judge. But the existence of bail bondsmen works the process because a judge, knowing a person can be released from jail by paying 10% of whatever they set, automatically set bail at 10 times the amount they think is appropriate. So, and then also, because bail bondsmen make more money when bail is set higher, there's a long history of bail bondsmen corrupting the judiciary. Just this last year, there was a federal judge in Louisiana who was convicted of corruption through the bail bond process. Okay. So basically, for many years, states have considered limiting the role of bail bonding, and in response, ALEC joined the American Legislative Exchange Council, which it calls the industry's life preserver. So there's 12 bail bond bills that prop up the industry. And as I mentioned, Wisconsin's banned commercial bail bonding for many years. And the legislators in Wisconsin who have tried to reopen Wisconsin to bail bonding have all been ALEC members. This year, the state chair of ALEC in Wisconsin, Robin Bose, slipped a provision into the budget that would pave the way for bail bondsmen to return to the state. The same effort was made several years ago by Wisconsin Rep. Scott Souter, former co-chair of the ALEC Criminal Justice Task Force. And I can discuss that a little bit later. So I will note that if you remember, I discussed how ALEC's tough sentencing laws led to rising incarceration costs, and there's really been a pushback where legislators from both sides of the aisle are realizing that we just can't afford to keep so many people behind bars. So in the search for solutions, ALEC has put one forward. And it doesn't just propose to expand parole or implement more evidence-based practices like drug rehab and intervention. Their proposal is to basically privatize the parole process and set up bail bond companies as private parole agencies. So this bill is called the Conditional Early Release Bond Act. And we know already that the bail bond industry is motivated by profit rather than concern for public safety. And independent statistics show that bail bonding is not more effective than state-run systems. But according to ALEC, and I'll quote, the program would rely on the proven success of the private bail bond industry rather than the proven dysfunction of the government-run parole and probation system. So this bill really only makes sense if you repeat the mantra, everything private is good, everything public is bad enough times. It's also a really good indication of what a lot of these ALEC bills are trying to do. In this case, there is a genuine problem to be solved. There's too many people in prison. But the ALEC solution is not predicated on what might be most effective, but on how one of its corporate members can profit off of a proposed solution.